hello there. My name is Carrie, and today...
I'm Carl!
Yep, thanks, Carl. And today, we're gonna do a couple of cool projects. Because 2 is how many you deserve. Not just 1, 2 whole projects. That's this many. No, also no. This many. So many. You're gonna stuff yourself silly with projects. It's like a project buffet, and you brought an appetite so big you're gonna have your own toilet seat for halftime. Yeah, this right here, this is an office chair if you're a real champ. No half-assing going on there. That is some full assing. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's going to be fun. We're going to cover some stuff you may not be familiar with and dig deep into stuff you only think you're familiar with so you can concept and make stuff with godlike clarity. Talk about style and design strategies, showing versus telling, really a bunch of things, all focusing on how to execute ideas that are really yours. We'll get academic and we'll get stupid. Probably real stupid. In a certain sense, the structures of these 2 projects are sort of similar, in that they're both about concepting and designing style frames and storyboards for short spots on a pitching schedule. And that's what we're going to focus on. But each project comes with very different challenges, so we're going to take very different approaches, and we'll get very different outcomes as a result. One like a series of matte paintings, and the other more like flat 2D graphics. And we'll talk about the thinking that leads down these different paths when all we're starting with is a blank page. Because both of these projects came to me as relatively open pitch requests. Open and unconstrained can be great, but it can also be difficult because without much direction, figuring out where to start is a challenge. So you may need to do some detective work first, and we're going to talk about how you can do exactly that with any type of project, so you have the means to make cooler stuff. The first project starts with an email from a studio kind of unfamiliar to me, asking to pitch stuff to them, which they would then pitch to a big network, who would then be subsequently pitching to a third group, which is a little weird. The story is this: a couple years ago in the realm of boxing, a fight between 2 legends in their class, Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao, had been hugely anticipated for years, and circumstances were ready to make that fight happen. The boxing experts were predicting that this match would be the most profitable in the entire history of boxing, so the fight promoters were looking at this as a singular event, calling it the fight of the century and so forth, and had several different networks vying for the rights to broadcast it. So both Showtime and HBO were in the running and would each have to demonstrate how they'd promote and broadcast the fight in order to win the certainly very lucrative rights to do so. So Showtime, looking to make the winning presentation, had called this particular studio, probably in addition to several other studios, who then, in all likelihood, each pulled in some number of freelancers on top of their own internal teams. So that's multiple networks, each commissioning multiple studios, each reaching out to multiple designers. That's a big pitch with a lot of people throwing weight into it, a lot of competition across the board, and only 2 days to bang it out. In essence, the pitch was focused on developing concepts for a 25-second promo. The direction this studio was giving was that they wanted the package to feel bigger than big, and be about these 2 fighters as the titans of the sport in an ultimate showdown. Now, ideally, a creative or art director develops a brief with more developed or specific direction to give. But in this case, it doesn't seem there had been much time afforded to the thinking, and with a deadline of 2 days for the entire pitch, you can imagine why that might be. Unfortunately, that kind of deadline is not at all uncommon, and whether for negligence or just lack of time, it often is the case that creative direction is sort of lacking. So where does that leave a designer who's tasked with generating a set of images that are intended to win an entire project? Well, faced with this situation, it's easy to be a little bewildered as to where to start. And staring at that white page is murder. So maybe you end up starting in some arbitrary place. But on a tight deadline, working blindly can really waste a lot of your very precious time and leave you with a bunch of meaningless, graphic-y crap. It's grap. That's totally a thing now because I just made it up. Grap.
Stop trying to make happen. It's not going to happen.
So let's do a little detective work to figure out what holes we have to fill. And let's start at the beginning by just looking at what a brief really is. Just so we're on the same page here. A brief tells you what the project's about and defines its boundaries. So the basics probably include scope, budget, deadlines, and deliverables, and hopefully there's an indication of some creative goals or visual direction. But a brief might first be coming from business or marketing people and won't be of much direct use to a design process. So that's where the creative director works with the client to develop some creative goals and then present the other creatives with a few simple and explorable concepts. But how does that process work when you're doing it by yourself, say as a freelancer, or when doing direct client work? Well, as in any project, you'll need to define the goal. If a client's coming to you, it's because they have a need or a concern, and you'll listen acutely to that need and turn it into something actionable. So the first step is to explore that need and translate it into a basic goal, which should always be a pretty simple statement of intent at first. Maybe the client is concerned that an audience doesn't understand their product. Your goal in that case would be to educate their audience on some topic related to the product. Like, maybe you need to explain how running makes ladies' feet smell like cheese, and how these new shoe inserts will keep that shit in check, girl. Or maybe the client needs to get people excited about their new movie release. So then your goal might be to generate mounting curiosity about the film, or to create a party atmosphere for environmental graphics for the premiere. Whatever that goal is, once you have it, you start defining its details by asking more specific questions. Namely, what exactly needs to be conveyed? Who's the audience? And how exactly will the final piece be presented? What, to whom, and how? That's basically it, but it's where you need to spend time extracting the specifics. What needs to be explained, and or what feeling or impression should the audience be left with? Do you need to explain how something helps solve a common problem? Like how apparently ridiculously hard it is to taco? That's a common problem right there. There goes your whole afternoon. Retarded children, am I right? Or are you trying to make them feel like a salad spinner will make their lives easier? You might then have to explain how a salad spinner works to solve a common problem that is just a real pain and demonstrate that in action. And then demonstrate the relief that it brings to a soccer mom's daily struggles. And boy, does it. Or does not, because that is moronic. You might have to get deeply psychological and present a subtle visual narrative that implies, say, the social value of supporting a certain charity. And you might have to break down that social value to understand what the benefit might be and what the target demographic is. Which lays pretty neatly into the next question of who's the audience? Who are you trying to speak to? What cultures do they feel they're a part of? What kinds of interests might they have? Sense of humor, taste, affluency and aspirations, or maybe their daily concerns. Exploring and defining these things as much as possible helps you relate to an audience. This starts to overlap with marketing concerns, but it doesn't mean that you have to take it all the way to building imaginary consumer profiles. You can still make something for an audience broader than white 20-something stay-at-home dads from Germany who day trade and do meat curing on the weekend. I mean, it's easy if your audience is that narrow, but clients usually come with greater hopes for reaching bigger audiences than that. So, North American males 18 to 45, or anyone looking for a mortgage, or, people who are hungry. These are what you start off with, and you have to drill down with your client, or in this case, for your client, to understand the real and important concerns of the audience. And then where will they most likely be when they see this? Will it be looping silently on a video poster in the middle of a mall with people walking past it all day, carrying heavy bags and towing tired children? Is it on a really small old screen in an airplane with a mostly captive audience? Or, maybe this is going on YouTube, and if so, is it something the audience will seek out, or something they're forced to watch but can also opt out of? How much time you have, in which format, in what context, under what sorts of conditions to reach what sorts of people in what part of their day? That stuff is super important to understand in at least as much detail as you can if you want your work to be paid any attention. Because there's so much stuff out there right now. Not only do you have to struggle to communicate something to the right people, you have to be specific about where they're going to see it and then fight like crazy for their attention in a sea of other messages also fighting for their attention. On top of all this, you're going to make something your client has to be into because they're the ones paying for your services. So it's super important to know what they're really looking for. For instance, your design explorations are going to look a lot different if they're looking for the cheapest solution than if they're looking for the most sophisticated solution, if you know what I mean. So you have to know whether they want cheap or fast or well made. Maybe they just want to be well serviced and feel comfortable in the relationship, whatever the outcome. Or to have an on-call pixel pusher to micromanage and fill their requests. Or have an artist author something original. Whatever those desires are, you have to be upfront about whether you can or want to cater to those desires. And through all of that, you are, in the end, making something for the audience. So you have to take all this guidance and indication and concern and direction and funnel it into something that is valuable in some way to that audience. Maybe make it informative or compelling or beautiful or hilarious or cute, but it has to mean something to the audience. It has to get their attention and then matter to them. Okay, so wow, that sounds like a task. Maybe it sounds complicated, but thankfully it's really not. It's basically listening more deeply. It's about gathering as much of the right kind of information as you can get and letting that help point you in more specific directions so you're making better decisions. And if you're staring at a blank page, it can really help you get started much more easily. So, what do we know about this project? Well, honestly, not much. And with a small studio managing an internal team and additional freelancers on a short timeline, information's not flowing freely. All right then, we're gonna have to detective it. What, to whom, and how? Well, we need to explain that the fight of the century is going down. So we need to say that and somehow convey how compelling that is. And then of course, there will be some explanation of when and where to see the fight, probably at the end. But most of the effort will be in making it compelling. And to that end, the studio's relatively vague direction is that it should feel like the titans of sport in a matchup that's bigger than big. All right, who's the audience here? Well, normally you might say boxing fans, but this is like a World Cup level event for boxing, so it probably extends past boxing fans to some of their friends and maybe other sports fans and even casual observers. It's going to be a pretty broad demographic, although plenty of people are not into watching two men beat the shit out of each other, but even still, it has to appeal to people who may not know that much about the sport, or even sports in general. So that appeal may have to be more about drama, maybe of the struggle or of combat or rivalry or some other narrative entirely. For something this big, there will probably be a really broad spectrum of media employed to get the word out. Whatever kind of imagery we come up with may end up on billboards, web banners, drink cups at Burger King, who knows? But our only concern here at the start is the 30-second commercial spots that will run probably tirelessly, not just on Showtime in this case, but probably on other networks, and will also undoubtedly get slammed in people's faces when they're trying to watch something on YouTube, and they'll be impatiently waiting until they can choose to skip it. On YouTube, you've got someone who's actively chosen to watch something of interest to them, and they're probably fairly engaged, but first, they have to watch your thing. And they don't want to watch your thing. And in fact, you're probably getting in their way. So part of the job is to convince them otherwise. And considering how ads there work, currently you've got 5 seconds to do that. On Showtime, people are probably watching much more passively, because these are going to be the commercials playing after whatever they just watched. And there's lots of them. And they may be using a DVR or recording service of some kind, meaning they're skipping through commercials. But, we can't control for people who literally aren't going to see this. So let's let the marketers and ad buyers worry about that. So all things considered, we'll need to make an appeal to a fairly broad audience of people, not necessarily sports enthusiasts, and we'll have to draw them in the first few seconds. Different people will approach this problem from different angles, of course, but what it suggests to me is that this has to be more about the drama, whatever form that takes. Maybe it's about a longing for greatness, or the incredibly high stakes involved, or about the clash of titans, or the lifetime of dedicated training leading not just to a one-on-one match, but to fractions of a second in that match that mean total success or failure. But it also suggests that if we're going to get their attention when they may not be paying any whatsoever, and then hold their attention past the first few seconds, then we have to make them curious at the outset somehow. So maybe there should be some mystery to the imagery that unfolds over time. Something that makes a person curious enough that they'll give it another few seconds, and then maybe a few more. In addition, the studio's looking for something that's bigger than big, so we'll have to take that expectation into account and figure it into the approach. Now that's all still pretty vague, but what more specific things do we know we have? Well, while we start looking, we're thinking we'll go with something dramatic, which makes me think first of film or photography as a medium that we might work in. As far as elements go, we know we've got two boxers. Not that kind. Two legends of their sport. We've got the sport itself and all of the imagery that brings with it. Equipment, boxing ring, training gear. Old boxing posters are pretty cool. Fandom and crowds. Stuff like sweat and blood. The list goes on. So we can simply think about filmic or photographic ways of treating those things, like as dense collages of training gear, or macro shots of the ropes, or of sweat hitting the mat. And that's all fine and well, but when I filter all that back through the needs of the project, I'm not quite seeing any of that in a way that's bigger than big. At least not anything I haven't seen before, or that would be worth repeating. So let's reach a little further with some basic brainstorming. Like, what's actually bigger than big? I don't know. Mountains? Yeah, that's big. But we're thinking we need something dramatic, so what's dramatic about that? Well, plenty of things. I mean, they're mountains. Could we depict two men in a battle to conquer a mountain? Sure. Or the men could be more like titans, as mentioned, battling atop a mythically huge mountain in the heavens, like something from Greek mythology. Or we could go further. They could themselves be the size of mountains, running toward each other on some vast plains, dragging clouds behind them. But why stop there? We could go bigger still. Maybe they're planet-sized, smashing their way through solar systems to meet each other in combat. Like this is an unstoppable cosmic event, an inevitable collision of celestial figures. Or like the stories told of constellations and the battles waged among the stars. That could be kind of cool. We can actually do that. It's definitely big in a certain sense. Now, it's certainly debatable whether that's the right direction yet or not, but here's the thing. I like working with space imagery, and an idea like that gets the ball rolling. And with a project as vague as this, it gives us some reasons to get something specific on the page. Ideally, you don't want to rush into something, but on a short deadline, if you've got a good foundation from the deep listening and detective work, then getting your brainstorming done and getting to the point where you can start making something is generally good, because you'll discover a lot of things in the making. Sometimes what you'll discover is that the idea isn't panning out, and that's fair. Sometimes you just gotta bail. But other times you'll find a thread you like, and as you follow it, that idea will take shape into something more defined, more specific, and more interesting. And you'll be making decisions to further shape it instead of just mashing a bunch of arbitrary, shiny garbage together. And that's good, because we're really working in the dark on this project. We can't really get insight from the client, and with 2 days to pull something off, it's terrifying to have burned through a bunch of your time and still be staring at that blank page. So in order to make the best use of the time we have, we're going to start here and assess it as we go. Now at this point, it's more of a loose concept than it is a strict narrative with start, middle, and end. We're thinking mystery is a good strategy, but we don't necessarily know where the mystery is going to come from just yet. So it's fine to start with a representative image, and having one of these colossal fighters slamming his way through a planet can serve as a kind of midpoint to the storyboard, and we can work out what kind of start and end we want as we make our way through it. So right now, we're just exploring the elements, figuring out how they work best, kind of roughing out the composition, and thinking about how to convey the admittedly weird idea that there's godlike dudes in space ramming planets. Now, I'm not super into the composition as it's developing, but as things change over the course of making imagery, a lot of times the composition is going to have to change too. So you hope that that happens naturally as you figure out what you're working with. Again, when dealing with a compressed timeline, you tend to have to gamble a little bit for the sake of speed, and both trust in your process while looking at what's coming out of it with a really honest, critical eye. This first part, where you're working to establish basically everything, can be hard because you're still wrapping your head around the basics of the project while figuring out aesthetics and gathering elements and thinking about the concept. It's a lot. Your head may be swirling trying to sort everything out because the possibilities are endless. It's equal parts daunting and exciting, but just the act of working on the first few images gives your head time to do its swirling and start to sort through everything. So we're working on a basic idea for this frame, and we've got these three main elements at this point: the foreground planet, the fighter, and this background nebula. And compositionally, that works for depth. We sort of know what's in front and what's behind because this is occluding that. But the sizes of these elements are all vaguely similar, which bugs me. Going back to the video about composition, this affects the read order negatively because you don't know where to look first. But the plan is to have a bunch of debris falling off to the right. So there's not a lot of space to expand, say, the planet out to the right to make it significantly bigger. So the effort instead is going to be to slowly work to vary the values of each of these objects and pay attention to where the density of detail is the highest and lowest so that the read order is a little bit more apparent. We don't want the background screaming for attention when that's not what's really important. But we also want enough color and light back there so that it can frame the silhouette of the fighter a little better, because otherwise he's almost black on black. And that balance will have to keep getting adjusted as we work. Where's the focus and why? How do we shift the focus to where it needs to be without fully losing something else? As the background develops, overall it's getting a little dimmer bit by bit, and parts of it are being selectively brought back so that it doesn't completely disappear. But that's really intended to shift the focus away from the background and a little more toward the center where the main action is. And progress is intentionally being made kind of all over that area to keep massaging that balance. Cooling those colors down by pushing them toward desaturated blues and purples really helps it recede too. And this warmer stuff is popping now because of that contrast. Now, compositionally, it's still not working super well yet, because everything's kind of arbitrarily jammed up to the left, like a photo that's cropped too wide. And the fighter and the planet are still kind of similar in scale, which isn't really working. And the reason why is this guy's punching a planet. That's it, it's because he's punching a planet, so stuff's on the left, obviously. Logic. What's happening is that the scene is still getting blocked out, and there's potentially got to be some room left over for stuff to the right. We have to show the effect of that punch, or it'll just look like he's high-fiving a planet or whatever. So this planet's got to look like it's really taking a beating. Just getting destroyed by this world-ending power, right? Bigger than big. As a start, we'll lay down these cracks, and of course he's cracking through the entire planetary crust, so the hot mantle underneath is going to be showing, and that's molten hot material, so it needs to glow out of these cracks, which we can quickly paint in with a soft brush. Then we got to carve out the huge chunk he's taking out of the back side of this thing, and oh boy, is it going to be a hot mess under there. So we've got all this high frequency detail, hot magma stuff, and all this really just through thinking about how cracks might look and masking stuff out to achieve that. But of course, debris is going to go flying like you wouldn't believe, so we got to pile up all this rock and try to indicate that it's flying away from the impact point. So there was some forward thinking about needing some space for that sort of thing off to the right. And now we can play with dropping in layers upon layers of this basic debris from some archive I've got, because there was some forethought about that, and now there's room left over for it. In Photoshop, of course, this sort of stuff is really adjustable at most stages, and this empty space is more like a mental note saying, do something over here, dummy. So we've got space now to tweak each layer into place to indicate movement as if this stuff was being sent into orbit, and we'll see about making that planet bigger if we can, just to resolve the awkward scale similarity. We'll also talk about your mental visual library in a bit, because it really comes into play when you need to imagine something like what happens to a planet when you punch it with a god-sized fist. We're going to try to build up a lot of complexity through layers and textures, and we have to make sure it at least makes some kind of sense as a result. So being curious and finding out about things in general is hugely helpful when you get into making stuff, because little bits of knowledge and experience you've picked up randomly will always come into play and inform what you make. So now that all that chaos is developing, we need to again make sure that things in the frame aren't competing too much for attention. So we're keeping it relatively dark, but that's just not quite enough. And given the huge scale of this scene, something like depth of field probably wouldn't be technically noticeable, but we really need something like that just to back the focus off of this background. And look at that! Now the central elements are popping a little better. That one move, defocusing the background element a little, both gives us a bit of depth and decreases the detail over on the left to make it a little less visually distracting. That solves a lot of problems, so I think that's a keeper. And that's something we can play with, because that depth is really nice. And maybe there could be some far foreground elements like these rocks that are slightly blurred as well. Although bearing in mind that the more we do it, the smaller the scene will feel, kind of like macro photography. Yeah, maybe best not to go crazy with that. But we can definitely go crazier in making this collision feel big. It takes some playing with what works best, but just continuing to heat this area up by layering in signifiers of this kind of explosive eruption that stay in that warm color range. Magma flows and erupting volcanoes are kind of great for that and work together pretty easily. And all we have to do is figure out how to place them around this sphere to help define it, as opposed to completely covering it up. Because obviously it's chaotic, but we're not just looking to make a mess. Every signifier is important here, and it's a bit of a balance to make sure they're all playing nice and adding up to something, not just covering each other up. Some in front, some in back. It's dense, but it'll work best if the elements are still used judiciously. So realistically, we're probably 6 or 8 hours into this already, because there's some thinking time and then a lot of finding and cutting out images, setting stuff up, figuring out how the composition might work, developing the idea. You know, these sort of establishing frames just eat up more time. And in this situation, we need to keep assessing whether it's going to work, because there's really no way to be sure that this idea has legs yet. If you were to show this one image by itself, it's certainly not conveying most of the things that we needed to. It's not so much drama as it is sensationalism. There's no mystery yet. We only have one fighter. You know, we're missing a lot of stuff here. And that's fine. We have multiple frames to let this play out. But if it's gonna work, it's time to explore those other frames. Otherwise, we may end up rushing them and then the idea won't work. So what do we have to accomplish? We have to feature both fighters somehow, and make a compelling argument to watch this fight, which we were gonna do by talking about some dramatic aspect to this whole thing, and use a little mystery to generate a kind of unfolding curiosity to keep pulling viewers through it. So far, we've started establishing this idea of a god-sized fighter somewhere in the cosmos. So we've kind of introduced one of the fighters. I'm thinking this is Pacquiao, and we have a setting of sorts. This is kind of a key image because it does do a lot of storytelling on its own, but it does it at the expense of almost being overdeveloped and obsessed over, so maybe this is a kind of a hero frame, and that's great. But meanwhile, we don't have the other fighter. We need some mystery, and we definitely need the idea that these titans are working their way toward colliding with each other. since we're working against a deadline, we'll see how we can start bringing those things in before we get ridiculously squeezed for time. Let's quickly figure out what this sequence might look like if we only had, say, 5 images total to tell the whole story. As in all basic stories, of course, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So there could be an intro image or two to create some interest, some mystery. Then there might be a frame showing one of the fighters running through space, because running is how you get through space. You know that. And then we can follow that with this image we've already got of the other one running from the opposite direction, smashing through a planet like an unstoppable force. And then the last frame could show them both about to collide, each dragging huge clouds of planetary wreckage behind them. Ideally, we'll have more frames than that, so we can really push the drama by getting cinematic about it and do close-ups and wides and really show some compelling moments and convey the immense scale of this and how the fighters are on a collision course and there's no stopping it. Get into the metaphor of this as an impending cosmic event, with some nod to the idea of modern gods waging battles in the heavens. But again, there's not a lot of time to pull that off, and you have to feel out what the bare minimum might be first. What's the most critical for your client to see to get them on board? And in this case, the idea is maybe a little unexpected for this client, so it's kind of important that we make the narratives make sense to them first. So let's make sure we cover the key story points first, and then we can fill it out more as time allows. With that in mind, let's figure out this end of the story, where the elements are going to be slowly revealed, before the conflict really ramps up. In episode 6, we talked about the benefit of having a storytelling strategy, and used the hero's journey in specific as a guide to figure out what holes we could fill to make it more interesting. Now that's clearly a more complex story structure than we're going to start with here. This can be way simpler, like a really basic story arc, but it's still helpful to have a framework like this in mind to use as a guidepost. And in anything you make where things evolve over time, that can be the case, even if it's 3 seconds long. Start, middle, and end. Even when you're making short graphics or sequences meant to be inserted into a larger project, you have to know what part your piece plays in helping that overall story. You're going to execute it a little differently if it's meant to fit here than if it's some kind of climax or if it's an outro. In basic dramatic story structures, first we typically introduce the elements or players involved. Then we uncover a crisis or a problem or a conflict of some kind, which implies a goal for the players to work toward, and there's generally increasing tension as they struggle to make progress. Then there's a climax in which that goal is met somehow and the story settles to some kind of finish. And despite the fact that that's super basic and we're probably all really familiar with it, it's still really helpful to have a framework like this in mind as a guide. Here we introduce the fighters, then start to imply a conflict. But we'll leave that a little ambiguous because we don't want to spill the beans immediately. Then the conflict is rising as they're racing toward each other. Powerful forces with furious intent and impending doom and all that. So then where's the climax? Is it here? Well, the way I'm thinking about it is that the climax to this story should be the actual fight event itself when it takes place on whatever the date is. So the final frame represents the moment just before the climax, and we don't give the viewer the satisfaction of an outcome or of resolution. So I think this spot is actually this part of the overall story, and the end of this part is kind of a cliffhanger. It's like a tease. It entices the viewer to tune in for the actual fight as the conclusion of the story. For now, let's work on this end and establish what all this looks like before it gets chaotic and tense. Partly because pulling off the mysterious intro is kind of a big question mark at this point. Visually, it should be less chaotic and simpler than this image, so that the spot can slowly ramp up to this point, instead of, screaming and planet punching the whole time, which means we kind of have to establish how that looks and why. Now, this is an actual image of Floyd Mayweather and his slightly awkward facial hair, which is great, except for the facial hair. Well, that and the fact that it's intentionally overlit, because by contrast, this frame is pretty dark, so we'll have to knock this back to more of a silhouette. But that's good for the mystery angle, too. So we can do that through basic levels adjustment, but that tends to crush the midtones in a way that I don't really like. So I have this trick where I make a copy of the layer, desaturate that copy, set it to multiply, and then run levels more subtly on that. That's kind of like my rare pro trick. Rad. And I guess that we don't really want it to just look like a dude in space. I mean, if it's going to be a clash of godlike figures, we would do well to treat it in some slightly less standard way. Although in doing so, we still have to keep in mind that this frame shouldn't become chaotic as a result of what we do here. We'll bring the chaos and tension in on later frames, so just a light touch here is probably best. How we do that is really subjective, and it comes down to the issue of style, or even better, personal voice, which we'll get into later. For now, my tendency is to think that since we're making imagery that looks more photographic as opposed to painterly or collaged or graphic or illustrative or whatever, maybe the way we treat this guy should feel photographic. And to that end, this exploration is mostly about photographic effects, lensing and light artifacts and stuff, bringing in just a little color variation, some naturalism. And we can also try making a reference to that idea about constellations, mythological figures battling in the heavens and all that. I think that might help make this whole scenario a little more coherent, but we'll see. Being able to afford the time to explore like this and find something in the making is going to be more and less likely depending on the job and the client. So when you have the time to do some R&D, you have to treat it as a valuable commodity and manage that time so it's not wasted on something less deserving. And that kind of time management stuff is complicated. Obviously, your idea as a whole can really suffer if you spend all of your time noodling some specific detail to death too early. So keeping track of those things, balancing the amount of time you give them, and spreading your attention all over the frame and over multiple frames as you move forward is really important. Because to really sell this particular idea, to convey it in a way that the art or creative director can understand and get behind, I figure we probably need at least 3 of these frames pretty well fleshed out. A kind of establishing shot, a shot describing the conflict, and one describing how it will all resolve. Those are really the priority, and we can fill out the rest as much as possible. So far, this frame is clearly the most developed, which is good, and this one is coming along, but the resolution doesn't exist. So what happens is you've got something in your head, and you're racing against the inevitable moment when that creative director taps on your shoulder or blasts an email or maybe just rolls over in bed or descends from the heavens and goes,
"Show me what you got. I want to see what you got."
Oh boy, time to go, Morty.
Where?
Probably to go pee your pants a little, Morty, because the ideas are still just floating in your head, and saying, "It's gonna be great, trust me," doesn't always inspire confidence. And surprise, surprise, this is that moment. The creative director, pressed for time and understandably anxious to make sure something presentable and valuable will come out of this, shoots an email asking for a look at the progress. And at that point, you may honestly need a few minutes just to get it in a presentable condition. But it's time to let the gods rain judgment down on it. If I really believe an idea has legs, but I'm just not selling it yet, I usually send the stills with a short written description of what's supposed to be happening and what's still missing. And with all of that, a decent creative or art director can tell whether you're headed in a direction that will benefit the pitch, whether it can be salvaged or whether it'd be better to bail out. In this case, the creative director didn't feel like this was heading in a useful direction, which is totally fair. Although there wasn't any explanation as to why, which is difficult. Sometimes you commit to an idea and it's just not appealing to the client.
Boo, not cool.
It's a fast process, and if you're dedicated to making something different or new and valuable for your client, you're going to be gambling on whether you can pull it off and whether they're going to like it either way. I think this ended up looking pretty good, especially with that last-minute subtle addition of the constellation idea. The stars in the eyes looks kind of menacing, which is really appropriate for this project. And in this case, feedback from the creative director was that the frames did look good, but going interstellar wasn't the kind of bigger than big that appealed to him. So the direction was to put this aside and just kick out another idea. Fortunately, I'd been thinking about this problem in a slightly more earthbound, less planet-punching kind of way. All the same conditions and needs apply, but we're going to think of the fighters less as gods and more as kings. It's not that much different, really. Still using a metaphor, but actually a pretty good metaphor for their positions in the world of boxing, if you think about it. These guys are legends. They've been around a while, eyeing each other's territory and claim, and are coming together to see who really reigns supreme. So I had this image in mind of two opposing castles on peaks across a valley from each other, dark and in ruin from years of battle. There are these warrior kings on their respective thrones who rise and descend into the valley for one final ruinous personal war. So basically the same sort of structure as the first idea, just in a different context and with a slightly different mood. But it seems like it might actually fit the criteria a little better, which is exciting. So even without any indication of why, the rejection of the first idea may have put us on a better path. Now, you could visualize that sequence of events, that story, in a million different ways, obviously. And the way that you personally go about realizing it comes down to your interests, your working process, your skills, your tastes in color and form, the things you've exposed yourself to, your experiences, really everything about you. And that's where this discussion of style versus voice comes in, and it makes a big difference to be able to nail down the distinctions between each. So let's do that, because a lot of people use terms like style, voice, or trend kind of interchangeably, and that's fine, but for our purposes, right now, let's think about it like this. An artist's voice comes out of all the things I just mentioned. What you make and the way you make it is all informed by your personal experiences, your interests and tendencies, your unique view of the world. Now that can play itself out in a lot of different ways. In my work, for example, there's variety, but you can see common themes, interests, and ways of making images. I like textural things, tactile things, like wood and paper and concrete. I tend toward collaging things together because I started out more as an illustrator than incorporated design thinking, and then some filmic or photographic strategies. My color palettes are usually pretty simple, like a single color and maybe an accent, because I tend to generate most of the visual potency of my imagery from detailed shapes and compositional contrast, because I grew up drawing a lot, making stuff in black and white. And you can see that pretty clearly in the work I did like 10 or 15 years ago. This isn't terrible, but it's still embarrassing to look at. I'm really bearing my soul to you, but maybe more importantly, there are attitudes and ideas that I return to repeatedly, like referencing printed materials or calling out to things from my childhood, like, nerdy Tron stuff or thinking about outer space. All of these and a host of reasons specific to my experience are why this image is going to come together the way it is. Everything from coming up with this idea to choosing these particular elements, all the way down to the idiosyncrasies of how I tend to cut them out and treat them. There's a lot of variables that add up to something. All these things, the common themes, interests, techniques, influences, and even the smallest gestures that distinguish you from me and every other artist, that's part of your voice. And your voice is the thing that makes you and your work unique. And so when it's really unique, it can be the most valuable aspect of your work, because no one else can do it quite the way you do it. So if your voice is developed well and it's unique and interesting, then there will be clients who like the way you do it. And they can't get that thing from anyone but you, Which isn't to say they won't try for a cheap facsimile, but at least you have a kind of monopoly on something they really want. So that said, of course, another way to approach visualizing the story of warrior kings descending from their thrones for a final war is to adopt what we typically call a style. Essentially you look at someone else's work, identify some core elements, a common theme, or maybe a distinctive appearance, a reproducible method, and, copy them for your own projects. And we're not talking about simply gathering references or looking for inspiration, although we might be if that's taken far enough. Typically, when an artist has developed a unique voice and is producing work that's consistent and identifiable, and here's an important part, inspiring enough to be worth stealing, people will start to borrow from that work because, of course, it looks cool, and it's kind of a common urge when we're inspired by something to want to partake in that thing. And when an artist develops something over time as a result of their interests and process, and then a bunch of people start basically imitating aspects of that work, that's when it really starts to be visible as a more public sort of style that's escaped from the original artist. It's not really being used as an expression of that artist's personal interests and experience and process, and it's become more a recipe for making things in general. And that look or style ends up getting applied by other people to things that are eventually totally divorced from whatever reasons the original artist had for developing it, which tends to make the derivative work feel arbitrary and forced and somehow usually less interesting for having lost some authenticity. And then when seemingly everyone's applying a version of that recipe to all sorts of projects, that's when we end up calling it a trend. Now, trends come in different forms, and they survive to different degrees, and they can be great in the sense that you'll get excited about some of them and inspired to make work that's influenced by them. And inspiration is good. The trick, of course, is that you have to guard against simply mimicking work you're inspired by and invest as much as possible in developing your own voice, or you'll kind of end up doing stuff like this, for example. Everyone and their mom has done this shit at this point, including me. And why? In the US, this is a news package. What? It doesn't even make sense anymore. How is this news? This is just people repeating other people. But this trend is now so commonplace, it's kind of what we think by default. And as much as that doesn't help the client communicate their unique value, making this crap certainly doesn't help you demonstrate your unique value either. Because if you're just following a trend, well, now your work is more or less indistinguishable from anyone else who's following that trend. So there's really no reason for anyone to pay attention to your work any more than any of those other people's work. There's nothing surprising or uniquely exciting about your work. But it's also not nearly as satisfying to have made work according to an established recipe that's not your own. And from a design perspective, slathering an established style all over client work doesn't really take into account that client's or that project's unique needs. Now, sometimes you're gonna do it. Students do it because they're learning. Pros do it because maybe they're learning too, or sometimes a client demands it, or they just need something already proven. But for the most part, the long-term strategy is to develop your voice and use it, and steal just little bits of other work to incorporate into yours, not go anywhere near wholesale mimicry of something. Mimicry is great for learning, but bad for careers. Steven Spielberg actually says it pretty well.
And I think it's okay that a first-time filmmaker, being so inspired by movies and music videos and any kind of music or media, can make a derivative film. It's okay that your first videos and your first attempts at telling a story are derivative, are obviously influenced by something that that you saw last week and you want to kind of do a version. There's nothing wrong with learning the ABCs, learning your craft by being derivative, but at some point you're going to need to find your natural voice and find a way to give voice to who you are. And who you are, by the way, who you are is original. It just is, because you're not Tom, you're not me, and you're not your best friend, and you're not your teacher, you're not your parents. You are you. And because of that, you do have, every bone in your body is an original bone. It's sometimes trying to figure out how to express your own originality, and that sometimes takes a number of years to figure yourself out.
The sort of famous quote is, "Good artists borrow, great artists steal," which is kind of snide, but of course what it means is that you can either take an idea from somewhere and use it in such a way that you're not really adding much value and people can recognize where it came from, or you can take it and transform it until no one knows where you got it and it's yours as far as anyone's concerned. In that case, you've added significant value to that idea through your voice, and you can take credit for that value. Where that line is can be subjective, but you sort of know it when you see it. And that line is the border between style and voice, between imitation and value. Ideally, you mimic a style to learn, but you take what you learn from imitating and keep moving forward and heavily integrate your own voice, instead of ending up as someone who's just following trends. That's pretty much always a good path to keep walking, and it's good to check in at points in your career to see where you are on that path. So the question here is, does this look like it borrows heavily from a specific style? Well, I suppose it certainly shares some characteristics with the work of others, and it kind of looks like fantastical Photoshop work, but no, I wouldn't say it adheres to a specific style. And that's not definitive, of course. Some people might disagree, but I certainly didn't have any strong visual references in mind when I started building it. So you might say it's simply emerging as a result of the way that I make things, my interests, my working processes, and my tendencies as an image maker. My voice, really. It's also emerging as a result of a very conscious strategy I've chosen to employ throughout this whole project, as a way of addressing the initial creative direction, which was to make it bigger than big. And that strategy is to approach the design in an additive way, to build up the idea by continuously adding relevant imagery and details, resulting in a kind of richness. We started this image with just the boxer, then added the stone throne and the steps and the night sky and multiple layers of castle ruins all around and the punching bags on chains, and we just keep adding details to develop and enrich the story. And some of those details don't work out all that well, but overall the strategy is to give the viewer a lot of information about what's going on. The trick is coming up with details that really do develop and enrich the story, but also knowing at what point adding more is only giving you diminishing returns for the time you're spending. And of course, always continuing to balance all these details out so that the image is legible and nice to look at. You know, an additive strategy doesn't mean slamming shit all up in every crevice is suddenly an awesome idea. Although sometimes it might be. It's probably not. Balancing the elements as details of the story by balancing them visually as details in the composition, that can be tricky sometimes. These crumbled stone walls are, I think, helping to tell the story, furthering the idea that this is a kingdom in ruin. So that's great. But it only does that if the important visual signifiers are legible. We have to be able to make out the silhouette and see that it's cobblestone so that we can understand it's an old broken castle wall. But while making sure of that, we also need to make sure that it's not so visually noisy that it makes the other elements hard to pick out. So as a solution, we've knocked it way back into shadow, but made sure some of the stone cobble texture is still visible, and then really let the silhouette of these shapes be read by setting them against a lighter background. Beyond simple aesthetics, this is how composition becomes really important. It allows the eye to pick up the important visual signifiers that convey the ideas or the story. You know, we're always looking for ways to solve these little compositional puzzles where we need to make sure a bunch of things can be seen and recognized without drowning each other out, and yet can still work together somehow to make an aesthetically pleasing image as a whole. So another idea to try out is these wooden beams. I'm thinking the punching bags could hang off of these beams, kind of referencing people hanging from the gallows, which, to be fair, is an appropriate mashup of boxing and this idea of a castle in ruins from so much war, kind of like they're defeated foes. But as clever a metaphor as I think that is, man, that is a pretty dark story element for a sports promo. I mean, I think it's cool because I'm apparently an emotionally unbalanced individual, but you throw in a story element that provocative and it's gonna kind of dominate. And my intuition says that this particular studio won't exactly eat that up. On top of that, the composition kind of needs something different as well. So far, the elements are fairly evenly spread around the frame. A lot of them are at roughly the same scale, so there's not a lot of hierarchy or depth. These wooden gallows would have to kind of block up more of this open sky, and because of where they'd have to sit, they'd be at basically the same depth in the scene as the throne and the punching bags and our fake Floyd Mayweather. So everything's starting to look really flat. So right now, it's failing to work compositionally. Now, we could totally try to fix that for the sake of composition. Probably have them pushing into the frame from out here for some more depth. But it still fails as a story detail by probably being overly gloomy or even morbid, and it just wouldn't make sense to keep at it. Compositionally, because of that depth problem, we still need some foreground elements. So a story element I thought would be good for that was some banners up front. And since this is meant to be Mayweather's castle and he's from the US, we gotta go with an American flag. Hung kind of like a crested banner would be, marking his kingdom, but tattered because his kingdom has seen a lot of battle. And we can do something similar with the Filipino flag when we build out Pacquiao's war-torn castle. So as a detail, this should work pretty well, both as a story element and as a compositional element. It helps further suggest the idea that this guy isn't just sitting in some ruins somewhere, that it's somehow his weathered kingdom, and an American one at that. Compositionally, we get to introduce something into the foreground so the frame isn't so flat, and we also get a bit of an accent color out of it, which is great. So we'll really pay attention to conveying some distance with it, maybe stacking a few of them in front of each other, indicating some depth of field, letting some parts catch this light that's cast through the scene. That's a good direction to be headed in. The problem is that sometimes you feel like you're still developing something when
you've got mail.
Yeah, time runs out and someone needs to assess the work. And ideally, your time management is good and the frames are self-explanatory by the time you think someone will come calling. In this case, we've got one frame out of the 4 or 5 we'd need to sell it. First frame's always the hardest. So for the creative director's benefit, I wrote another short synopsis of what I was planning and sent it off with the image. Being able to coherently explain your intentions is a ridiculously valuable skill and also a surprisingly hard one. Because when you find yourself having to vocalize what you're doing, a lot of times you kind of realize that you don't really know what you're doing. So for projects with compressed schedules like this, you may find that trying to concisely explain your ideas to yourself while you're working will help you to develop those ideas more concretely and help you keep refining what you think your goals are. And then subsequently, when you're only partly done and asked to explain it to someone else, they'll more likely feel like you're not an idiot and that you actually have something concrete in mind and should keep pursuing it. So to help you sort out your own thinking while you're working, it might sound ridiculous, but try talking to yourself about what you think you're making and keep doing that until you can state the goal concisely and how you're achieving it and be convinced of that. The goal and how you're getting to it basically breaks down into the what and the how. For example, I'd say our goal right now is to dramatically introduce 2 legendary boxers and convey the tension of an impending fight between them. And how we're doing that is by working to show them as metaphorical warrior kings in their war-torn castles at the end of an era of battle, and using a kind of photorealism but weaving boxing references into their environments. When you can state the goal concisely, you can more easily critique it for yourself and adjust it. And then not only can you more easily work toward it and refine it, you can better communicate it to others for feedback. Having said that, of course, you're not always going to be met with the response you'd hope for. In this case, the response was understandable, and yet at the same time, sort of baffling. All right, that's fair enough. Okay, although I'm not sure what you... okay. What the fuck? Music video style, what is that? That's not even a thing, what the fuck? Okay, so now that you're drunk as hell, or you've torn a car door off with your bare hands, cried on the toilet, or whatever your thing is, you can go ahead and figure out the meaning behind these kinds of comments. This job in particular is a last-minute, high-pressure pitch for a small studio to win a potentially prominent project for a large client. And this direction is coming from the owner of that studio, late at night, and maybe not as rigorous or refined as it could be. And that happens. Sometimes you get feedback that's maybe muddled or vague or even seemingly terrible, and you have to find a way to honor its intentions. To give your clients some value when they just haven't been able to provide much themselves. And that can be frustrating. Or it can be a gift. Either way, it's a challenge, but it benefits you to treat that challenge as though it has hidden potential, and that you're going to find it. Because in reality, it's always there. And just like with a brief, you can dig in and do a little detective work to get at that potential. Okay, so Kanye power video. Alright, I get why this is a reference. Dark figure at the center with stuff radiating outward and kind of a maximalist image overall. So at least we know our additive design strategy is on point. Now clearly this imagery is also specifically old world. Columns, staffs, people in togas, heavenly backgrounds. Really the elements of Christian myth represented in the language of Baroque era painting, you know? I mean, I'm not really an art history buff, but look at the chiaroscuro lighting and the color schemes and just about everything. It's all crafted very deliberately like a Baroque painting. Structurally, it seems inspired by something like this. And of course, you know how Kanye sees himself at this point.
But I'm the best.
Oh, Kanye. Okay, but clearly our direction is to make it feel more modern. So my best guess is that the structure of our image is working for them. Hero at center with rich imagery radiating outward. We just need to modernize that imagery somehow. So let's save a copy and strip out a bunch of the old world references. Now, there was no mention of the tone in the feedback, so we'll assume that this mood is acceptable. Even the Kanye power video seems to be about a fall from grace, so we could probably keep this central character with his brooding pose, and maybe even the kind of crumbling throne. Since time is really dwindling on this project, having scored a couple of misses so far, let's try to be a little more literal about the reference we have. You know, not so much that we lapse into parody or ripoff, but we'll definitely borrow from it. You know, like we can use the punching bags even more like the columns are in the video, to draw the focus to our hero, and then add in more equipment and boxing references to fill out the scene. And since we've been trying to make these sort of scenes or locations or sets, we have to pay attention to the perspective and the lighting and all that. This sort of imagery is a little like doing matte painting almost, so I like to use Photoshop. Although as in most things, you could use whatever you like. Stuff like arranging the punching bags in a row like this is kind of fussy work in Photoshop and would probably be easier with an After Effects camera, or maybe you go all out and model it in 3D. But this would take me a while to model and texture and light in 3D, and I find it hard to paint in variation and lighting in After Effects. And variation is important because we want it to feel kind of natural. And in this kind of pitch, we're really conveying the concept and tone, and a final production probably won't rely so much on using any actual elements we make here. So for the overall job, I'm down with Photoshop. Nothing quite beats the speed of hack and slash and cut and paste and drag and drop when you're doing something specifically like this. And at this point, we need that kind of speed. There's a lot of freedom in this method. Although granted, we don't actually get a lot for free doing it this way. I mean, we're using bits of photography, so the elements don't need so much building like they would in 3D, so that's kind of free. But they do need finding. They're stills, so they're obviously frozen into their individual shot angles. The highlights and shadows are already burned in, so we can't just change their individual lighting sources. So that means taking a little extra care to find the right images. And those sorts of things provide some constraints for how we can use each element once we've got it. Everything has to work together, despite coming from completely different sources. But this is where I tend to rely on my illustration background by actually painting in additional light and painting in shadows and eyeballing the perspective of the whole scene and moving flat imagery around to form the composition. And the time I spent drawing as a teenager really developed my ability to do that. And not surprisingly, my interest in and my understanding of that workflow really informs how I choose to make images. A lot of other people might actually do this in 3D, or they might illustrate it, or set up a shoot, and it would turn out different. So again, you can see how your own workflows, your own experiences, your tendencies, your interests, where you're lazy and where you're diligent, all of this stuff is subtly informing your voice. Someone else might look at how I'm making this image and think, I never do it that way, that's stupid. And that's fine. That's one of the reasons my stuff looks like my stuff and theirs looks like, wet garbage. In trying to modernize this, some of the elements need a little adjusting, obviously. The punching bags were already appropriate, but it makes sense that we get some fresher looking flags and straighten up this throne so it's not quite so decrepit. This is totally something we could have done later, but these are the decisions you kind of have to make when measuring what your plans are versus what the deadline is. This is just time management stuff you have to keep track of in the back of your head. Like, okay, the deadline is tomorrow. The studio is in a time zone 3 hours ahead, and right now it's 11 o'clock at night, so it's already 2 a.m. their time. Given the missed shots so far, they're going to be itching to have something useful in their hands when they walk in the door tomorrow, which might be as early as 7 a.m., which would be 4 a.m. for us. Not that we want to be bulldozing away at 4 a.m., but that's the hard cutoff. So we'll need a little time for finishing, making JPEGs, packing it into an email and all that. So we'll say 3:30 is penned down, which gives us about 4.5 hours in total to build this all the way back up to where it needs to be. That's kind of an adrenalizing moment, especially having not scored any wins so far. So a lot of the mental puzzle solving now is the moment-to-moment decision-making of, does this really matter? Can I hide this flaw somehow, or do I have to clone all this crap out? How cleanly do I need to cut this element out? Will it still make sense and will it still look good if I skip some steps? Is it good enough if I just duplicate this thing and put another one over here, or will it look like a hack job? How much detail do I actually need in this area? Will it even be seen? Honestly, these are questions that need to be asked constantly, no matter what the deadline is. But when the pressure is really on, they literally become the difference between handing in something valuable and sort of reluctantly showing something that's half done and unpresentable because you simply spent time on the wrong things. So prioritizing is really important in this situation. And that means having as clear a grip on your goal as you possibly can so that you know what to prioritize. In episode 6, we talked a lot about goal-oriented design and how beneficial it is to both the process and to the outcome. In this situation, it's not just beneficial, it is crucial. We have some unknowns yet to resolve, but we're definitely aiming for something. We can focus mainly on filling the frame with boxing-related references, radiating outward from our hero in a kind of theatrical stage setting kind of way. And having that sort of framework in mind gives us a little freedom to throw in some outside ideas like this illuminated ring. Maybe it's built into the chair, maybe it's a halo, who knows? Maybe not the safest use of 10 precious minutes, but it's a little mysterious, a little unexpected, kind of curious, and that makes the image overall a little more interesting, a little cooler. But then we're right back at it, making decisions about whether we can just copy this flag and flip it, or if we have to grab a new one and cut it out. And in cutting it out, does it need to be ultra clean, or will that edge get hidden? Fast second-by-second decisions are the name of this game. This scene needs some kind of background, so what if it's inside a boxing ring? Can we make a really quick set of ropes to test that out? Maybe the throne can be the turnbuckle, so a simple set of lines will suffice here. Bam, there it is. Does that work? Nope, can't really see him. Should they tie into this halo thing for some reason? Nope, but worth a shot if it only took 15 seconds to assess, and we can always bring it back if it works later. And we know our goals and priorities, so we know what to move on to, so there's no wasting time after it fails. Granted, this part is sped up a little more than other parts because it's boring to watch and takes a long time. So don't think there's some magical way to get this kind of production work done faster at this point. Sometimes it just takes elbow grease, whatever the hell elbow grease is. I don't know. Ask your grandparents. It sounds gross to me, but it's a dumbbell, and if you've ever been to a gym, you know those things are greasy as hell. So it makes sense somehow. And elbows are... I don't know, ask your grandma what it means. And then sometimes you think you're a smarty pants and you can do it the fast way, and the computers go,
"No way, this looks like poop, you cheater. Now clean up your greasy mess."
And you want to sigh and get up and go look in the fridge for whatever, because maybe a pudding pop is a good idea. But shit, it's 1:15 a.m. and clock's ticking down to your doom, you lazy ass. You sit there and cut out boring exercise equipment. But it's boring and it's not really helping, and this background has nothing in it. No, we need like fight night concert style pyrotechnics is what we need. There we go. Yeah, buddy. Now you know what'll work better? Yeah, bringing them ropes back in. Should we even think about trying to find a photo of a ring that's shot at the right angle with the right lighting? Nope. 2 a.m. This works A-okay for now. Super adjustable. We can bang this out. And now the background is starting to come alive with some character appropriate to the idea. And we'll see if we can knock out some more boxing equipment and get it working in the composition, starting with elements that already fit the scheme to some degree. Like we'll stick with black leathers, rubber, dark materials. And again, making quick decisions about how much work it takes to test out versus how much potential there is in it. And as it turns out, these don't seem to be getting us much of anywhere. They're good to have as small story details, and we should hang on to them, but we really need more structural elements right now for this to come together. So this speed bag is something we can hopefully use in a repeated way, kind of like the big punching bags. And who knows what these columns are that they're going to hang from, but we need to hang the bags from something or they'll just look like balloons, which would be stupid. And the columns will actually do well to block out more space and provide more repetition and perspective. That's a bonus. Paying attention to the direction of the lighting on these, we can't just flip them around for variety because the scene lighting is from the right. So we'll darken some and brighten some for that variation and make sure the perspective isn't terrible, and we'll get a little bit of this depth of field in there by blurring the front ones a bit. And we just keep moving like this. We know our goals, we know what's working and what isn't, and it's 3 a.m. or whatever, and the brains will really start rotting any minute now. So we gotta get this settled soon to have enough time to check it over and make last-minute fixes and adjustments before sticking in an email can and blasting it across the country. We'll see if maybe this workout bench is another good structural element we can use in repetition like the bags, and that doesn't have a huge effect, but it helps a tiny bit. And now there's only a few minutes left, so let's just see if we can get in some wish list stuff, like getting a bit of subtle detail into this floor, which is honestly, again, almost unnoticeable, but has been bugging me. And then we can try making these flags a little more lively by faking a bit of diffused translucency, like the light from the pyrotechnics is backlighting them a bit. Some of these moves are really just still image compositing attempts, just desperately trying to glue disparate elements together into one scene. But building more detail into the background at this point and stealing the lights from somewhere else is kind of a Hail Mary, because suddenly they're the brightest thing in the frame. The side effect is that it makes a lot of the other elements feel much darker and changes the mood just a bit, but I think that's alright. And at the last second, we'll pop a bit of edge blur and chromatic aberration over the top, and ooh boy, it's done. That is it. We've hit the wall, and the clock has stopped. And just like in previous episodes, and like in most projects, you never really finish, but you do have to let it go. But I like this image. It really started out as a whole different thing that we hacked apart and back together, but it turned out alright. If we kept pushing the additive strategy, it could certainly go further. Litter this floor with equipment, fill the background out, thin these lights out, overall build in more descriptive story elements to flesh out the idea, and maybe doing that would take it from good to great, but who really knows? There's not like some kind of rich concept worked out yet, but the image is sort of evocative, and even as a single frame, it tells a story. It's dark and yet celebratory, which seems appropriate for boxing, where you've got all this fanfare and celebration surrounding two guys basically trying to brutalize each other until they're unconscious. It's got the hero in waiting, seated in his world of constant training, and I like this slightly weird element of the halo or whatever. It's kind of the thing that takes it from standard to just a little more intriguing. You know, it's an image that kind of captures a mood and a certain perspective, and it does so primarily by showing instead of telling, which we'll talk about more as we get into the next project. But it's able to do all this stuff because the composition shows you what's important and makes sure that the important elements are legible and recognizable. Value-wise, it's a pretty dark image, but the important signifying shapes are well delineated because their silhouettes are still visible. And there's just enough internal detail in those elements that you can pick up the signifying qualities of their materials and pretty easily figure out what they are. Like, you can really see this chain and this linkage where it splits, because even though there's a speed bag right behind it, there's a layer of something brighter backing it up. We can see those edges simply because there's something brighter against it to create that contrast, and those edges define the silhouette. And the silhouette goes a long way to telling you what you're looking at. Now, realistically, the right edges of each of those links would be lit up due to the lighting, and that would highlight the material. But the shape itself still tells you what it is without any light or internal detail. Certainly the same thing is true of the throne here. The whole thing isn't as crisp and defined as these top edges, but that's okay. In the same way that just enough important signifiers of punching bag are highlighted through silhouette and revealing some of the internal details, just the important parts are highlighted here. These lions are cool, but both of them don't need to be super visible for you to get it. As the viewer, your brain can fill in the rest. Again, same goes for the fighter. Whole sections of him are indistinguishable from what he's set against. But there's enough contrast in important areas to help your brain sort out where his body is, what his posture is like, and get pretty much everything you need to know. This halo thing really defines his shoulder line and the shape of his hood. But you wouldn't very well be able to tell that it's a hood if this part weren't illuminated a bit, ending sharply and implying his face hidden in shadow. That's been done down here too, where the background is dark, so to make the silhouette pop, this edge had to be brightened a bit. As a bonus, doing that brought back some of the internal detail of the stone texture and the chiseled chamfering. It's a constant play between lighter and darker to delineate edges so that a viewer can see the shapes and quickly figure out what they're looking at. This kind of compositional thinking is particularly helpful in an overall darker image like this, but it can be applicable in just about every case you'll run into. In defining shapes, you're always going to have to use some combination of contrast between the hues, saturations, textures, values, etc. In this case, it's almost entirely just the values because that's my own personal tendency. But you can see where it doesn't always work quite as well. These boxing gloves are kind of an important element, but they're pretty tough to make out because the edges are black, and so is the throne. And had we been paying attention, we could have fixed that. Maybe by knocking a hole in the underside of the throne's seat so you can see through to the relatively brighter background behind it, and the bottom edges of those gloves would stand out against it. We'd be changing the design of the throne, but that's a decision you weigh out when you come to it. Unfortunately, we never came to it, and this is one of those things that can get lost when time management fails and you get confused or blinded to what's most important. Not that the gloves are the most important, but they definitely should have been one of the central elements, so I'm kind of kicking myself a little for that. I'd like to think that since the feedback seemed to be that the first two directions weren't really on point, maybe this final singular image was of some real value to the studio. I've seen pitches go out with pages of full storyboards, and the client ended up focusing on a single style frame tacked onto the end. And that actually makes sense, because sometimes a single image leaves enough to the imagination that a client can imagine a lot of it for themselves. And a pitch may very intentionally feature style frames as opposed to full storyboards for that very reason. And especially if the ideas they're pitching are less narrative or just less defined. So in all likelihood, these first 3 frames probably didn't make it into the pitch, and this last one was probably somewhere near the end of the deck. As in a lot of off-site freelance jobs, because of the flurry of activity, you may never actually hear how the pitch turns out. You just have to go into it trying to make your contribution inspired or helpful in one way or another. And in the end, the actual fight event was so huge, it was handled jointly by Showtime and HBO, smashing all kinds of pay-per-view records, and ended up generating something like $500 million in revenue. There were documentaries leading up to it, and all sorts of celebrity involvement and media shenanigans. It was bananas. I don't know who ended up making the official promos for the fight, but it was pretty standard, pretty safe stuff. 2 fighters walking toward each other on a fake Las Vegas backdrop, which isn't at all surprising, really. The fight had a huge amount of hype, so from a business standpoint, it might actually make sense just to not rock the boat and gamble on an unknown. And especially given the audience and the amounts of money involved, it's not hard to understand why someone out there won the pitch on this premise. The client may very likely have been looking for a cheap solution, and this totally nails that with basically a green screen shoot and some compositing work. If they were looking for differentiation and branding, would any of these concepts have met that need? Well, the design has potential, but of course it's really tough to say once it hits execution. In the role of designer, you never know how close or far from your original frames a final production might end up. Because in a typical client-studio relationship, lots of people can end up having a voice in the final product, and that design by committee strategy is a tough one for any concept to go through and remain completely unchanged. But that potential is what we're shooting for, and I think any of these could actually be really cool. And that's something we'll touch on in the next part with the second project, which is kind of a 180 from this one, where we'll be using some very different design strategies. We'll also talk a little bit about smarter image making and the value of showing versus telling, building your own personal visual library, and how to kick ass on a project that's maybe not as glamorous as the fight of the century. So go grab yourself a pudding pop or take a nap, preferably not naked, but I don't really judge. Pants or no pants, just come on back, we'll rock a brand new thing.